It's great to be here. Pleasure to be back here in Birmingham, one of my favorite cities, home of the Curry Mile, home of my favorite Cadbury's. Whenever I'm in the UK, I stock up on dairy milk to take back to the US. And now home, it seems, to the annual Imam Hussein Summit. It's my second time here. It's great to be here. For this panel, we are talking about speaking truth to power at home. I'm joined by two very high-profile, high-achieving, influential women who really need no introduction, but I'm going to try anyways. To my left, the Right Honourable Sayeeda Warsi, Baroness Warsi, grew up in a family of Pakistani Muslim immigrants in West Yorkshire, became a lawyer, went on to become not just a life peer, but the first Muslim woman to attend cabinet in the history of the United Kingdom. I think that deserves applause. She served as co-chair of the Conservative Party, Minister without portfolio, Minister of State at the Foreign Office and Department of Communities Local Government, before resigning from government on principle over her objection to the British government stance on Israel during the bombardment of Gaza in 2014. She has since become a thorn, I think it's fair to say, in the side of her party's leadership on the issue of Tory Islamophobia, which of course doesn't exist and it's all imaginary. To my right is the Right Honourable Jo Swinson, former Member of Parliament and, of course, former leader of the Liberal Democrats, the first woman and the youngest person to ever hold that position at the age of 39. I'm 40, so I feel like, what have I been doing in my life if you're a party leader at 39? She also served in government in the Cameron-Clegg coalition as a junior minister in the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. She is known for her fervent opposition to Brexit, which some would argue it may have cost her job, something we might have to discuss. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel. So, one of the reasons we're here today is to commemorate, celebrate, remember a great woman from Muslim history, from human history, Zainab, the granddaughter of the Prophet, who was known for having gone forward and speaking truth to power in some of the most difficult circumstances possible. So I want to kick off with both of you. Sayeeda, what does it mean to you to speak truth to power, especially when you're in a position of power yourself?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, assalamu alaikum, and what a pleasure to be here, and what a pleasure to be on this panel. Jo, I consider to be a friend. We've worked together in government, but also since then. And of course, Mehdi Hasan, you know, the amazing journalist we all wish we were. Oh. I think for me, I suppose there's a sense that there is always something bigger than yourself. I think when you're in power, one of the things I talk about in terms of why, you know, Islam or my religion is important to me is because I say that Islam is a great way that tempers you during times of great success and supports you during times of distress. And the reason why I said the former is because when you're in a position of power, often people in power start to believe their own hype. People often start to believe that they're more powerful than they actually are. People believe that they can make huge changes rather than small incremental changes. And people also start to believe that this is the way it's going to be forever. So for me, speaking truth to power is about acknowledging that there is something bigger than who you are. And secondly, there is something bigger than what you're doing at that moment in time. And for me, the way I define that is really a sense of iman or humanity or however you want to refer to that, a sense that you are in the end accountable for the decisions that you make, the things that you say, the positions that you take, and that you will have to live with them and the consequences of those, irrespective of what position that you may hold at any one time. And look, the justification, you know, there were people in Nazi Germany who said, well, all I did was follow orders. All I did was do what I was being told by those in positions of power, that there were people more powerful than me and I couldn't even speak up. And, you know, we know from I suppose I'll finish on this, that from an Islamic perspective, you know, we know the teaching of the Prophet ﷺ when he says that when you see injustice, you have three choices. Raise your hand to stop it, raise your voice to speak out, or at least in your heart say, this is wrong.
Okay. Jo, let me ask you the same question. How do you speak truth to power if you're in a position of power yourself and privilege that others might not find themselves in?
Sure. Well, Delighted to be here at this wonderful event. I think I think in the title, the very word truth is an important one, which we can often take for granted, but I think there are reasons for us to be wary of how much we can all be comfortable relying on shared truths. I think it feels like some years ago we had that. We would know that there would be objective facts, and now it seems to be that is under assault in so many different ways, whether it's President Trump talking about the size of the crowds at his inauguration or things which are actually far more significant than that.
Coronavirus being a hoax, I believe, is the latest position.
Right, okay. So, I mean, the gift that keeps on giving, isn't he? Basically, I think it is incredibly important for everybody to be true to themselves and for us to be careful about respecting truth. But I think when you're in a position of power, there is an even greater responsibility on you to do that. And particularly because there are so many people who are relying on you. Power is also an interesting construct, because power sort of looks after itself. You know, powerful, you know, the kind of the corridors of power sort of protect others with power. And particularly, I think, when people who do not come from the groups which have usually been in those positions are put in that place, then again, I think there is that responsibility to try to make sure that you still hold on to those truths and that you stand up for those things. And sometimes that is straightforward, but very often it's not.
So both of you rose to very senior positions in the British political system, in the British political establishment, which tends to be, even today in 2020, dominated by old rich white men, I think it's fair to say. What kind of gender obstacles, and for you, Saida, religious and racial obstacles, did you have to overcome, the stereotypes, the tropes that you faced?
I think that the last panel made some really important points, that I think those challenges are not just in relation to the new places that you're inhabiting, and people like you haven't been there before. So, you know, of course, do people from working class backgrounds end up around the cabinet table? Do the kids of immigrants end up around the cabinet table? Do even, say, within the Muslim community, is it appropriate for Muslim women to want to seek leadership positions? So I think every time you're breaking a barrier, the fact that you're upsetting the accepted norm means that you're going to make people feel that little bit uncomfortable. But I think for me,
you did far more than make people feel uncomfortable, I think it's fair to say. That's an understatement.
I think there is a real... So when you enter the corridors or the rooms that people like you normally don't enter, there is a huge amount of pressure to fit in. There is a huge amount of pressure to, as a woman, to pretend that you're not a woman, to behave like men, to walk in and pretend that people haven't worked out that you're brown, to deny the fact that you're Muslim and say things like, you know, I'm not really a practicing Muslim, I'm of Muslim heritage. You know, all of this kind of denial goes on to say, I'm really quite an acceptable version of what you find unacceptable. And I think for me, I decided very early on that one, I have a shocking memory, so I'm never going to be able to remember what lie I've told somebody about who I am and who I'm not. But secondly, I'm not going to spend my life pretending to be somebody that I'm not. So many of you will recall that on the very first cabinet meeting, when, you know, there was this great David Cameron made a big thing of this. This is the first Muslim around to hold a full
You turned up in a
position.
shalwar kameez.
I went in a pink shalwar kameez.
Was that because you were trying to send a message, or it's just more comfortable?
Because one, it was a beautiful sunny day.
Okay.
It was a beautiful sunny day. It was the only outfit that I had never worn before in my wardrobe, and it was pressed. And on a normal kind of beautiful sunny day, I would have worn such a pink shalwar kameez. So I thought, well, why not? Why should I do anything differently? Because this is a cabinet meeting.
What did your cabinet colleagues say? Can you share that with us?
I think 2010.
What did Michael Gove say when he saw you turn up in a shalwar kameez?
He didn't say anything, but I'm sure he thought, my God, it's all downhill from now. But it's, I think 2010 was a very different world. I genuinely felt, look, there are lots of people, people now, I'm nearly 50, there are lots of people who are now coming up to 50 and kind of my generation who went through life, having to be Asian at home and having to be kind of white at school and having to fit in here and fit in there and be different versions of yourself. And then, like many of us who were successful, you got into your 30s and you and into your 40s and you started thinking, I'm done with having to be different versions of myself. These are all the different versions of myself and I'm going to bring them to the table. And I think 2010 was one of those moments where certainly I felt that I could bring all those different versions of myself to the table, and it was just, that was the way it is. My God, I now look back at 2010 and it feels like heaven compared to where we are now.
Joe, Saida talks about race, class, gender. You have gender and youth, I think it's fair, because you get the ageism where people kind of want to patronize you, not just because you're a woman, but you're a party leader under the age of 40?
Yeah, absolutely. How very dare she? So I just want to start by just putting in context. I want to tell the story of one of my idols, Shirley Williams, who, listening to her experiences of being a politician, from the 1960s onwards, she talks about when she first stood as a young woman candidate being referred to as the schoolgirl candidate by her opponent. She also told me, shockingly, of a time when she was a minister and the cabinet minister in her department had a heart attack and was in hospital. And there was a major crisis in her department. And the permanent secretary refused to speak to her because she was a woman. So literally you had civil servants ferrying written notes between her and the permanent secretary. And so you think about that in the 1960s where, a serving minister would not even, the permanent secretary of the department wouldn't even deign to have a conversation because she was a woman. And I think, okay, so to start with, we have made some progress, and I always think back to previous generations and the fights that they battled to make progress, and so that we and our generation can build on that. But yes, I mean, it wasn't for me a pink shower camise moment, but when I became a minister in 2012, it was pink shoes. And I just decided, after a few weeks of being a minister, that it was just too full on for me to try and do it pretending to be anyone else. But I looked around and I didn't see who the role models were who rocked up and did being a minister in pink shoes. And I thought, well, I'll just have to do that myself.
So you would have been, 31 when you were a minister?
32 when I became a minister.
So as a 32-year-old minister in government, how are you treated as a female 32-year-old minister in the British civil service and the British establishment at that time?
I have nothing but admiration for the civil service. I think it does vary from department to department, and the Perm Sec at the time, Martin Donnelly, was very forward-thinking. Flexible working within the department was standard. There was lots of job sharing among senior civil servants. Vince Cable was my Secretary of State, and so from a political perspective, there was that significant support that I had as a minister in the department. So that was all fine. And by that time in the House of Commons, I'd been an MP for 7 years. So, I'd stopped being a kind of novelty of, what's this young woman doing here? So actually that was fine. But interestingly, when I ran for the leadership of the Lib Dems, then it was a little bit, oh, hang on, is she ready? Is she experienced enough? I mean, I was 39, which was the same age that Charles Kennedy was when he became leader of the Liberal Democrats. I'd been, by that point, an MP for 12 years, which was much
older
longer
than William Hague was when he became...
Yeah, I'd been an MP for 12 years, much longer than Nick Clegg had been when he became leader, and in fact longer than Tim Farron had been when he became leader. I'd been a minister, which, with the exception of Vince Cable, no previous Liberal Democrat leader had been when they became leader. But yet, is she experienced enough? Is she ready? Is she able to do it? Were the questions that perhaps wouldn't have flowed if I was a 39-year-old man, or maybe if I was an older woman. Although I think with women, age is a double-edged sword, because you're too young for so much time, and then there's like a brief little whisper of a few months where you might be the right age, and then suddenly you're too old.
You're too old. And if you listen where I'm based now in the US, you listen to someone like Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's gone out of her way to say, if Pete Buttigieg was a woman, the former mayor of South Bend, would he have the same support? Would people tolerate a 32-year-old female from a tiny town? No, he has a kind of privilege that comes with being a young, dynamic man.
And even Kamala Harris couldn't raise the money
Indeed.
in the end, and yet obviously very
experienced, very qualified.
Exactly.
Some people say it's important, Joe, to have a woman in a position of power, in a position of leadership, as a role model, as an example to others, as an example of the power of diversity, as an illustration of gender equality. And then others say, well, hold on, look at a Margaret Thatcher. What did she actually do for women, both around her and in the country at large? As someone who's been a female party leader, how important do you think that achievement is in terms of the actual consequences on the ground for women?
I think it is hugely important, because I think it shows that it can be done. I mean, I look back to when I first became an MP at the age of 25, and I had gone for a selection to become a candidate when I was 23, before the Brent East by-election. And lots of people were, what on earth are you doing as this 23-year-old? Can you possibly do this? Was some of the questions I was getting. Then Sarah Tether was elected in the Brent East by-election, and she was, I think, 29 at the time. And then I did a selection campaign a couple of months later, and suddenly I had Lib Dem members saying to me, oh yeah, you could be like Sarah Tether. And it was almost like the idea that a young woman could be a Liberal Democrat MP did not exist until people had seen a young woman being a Liberal Democrat MP, because until that point, we'd only had a very small number of Lib Dem women MPs, and all of them had been elected in their late 40s or 50s or beyond. So I think role models are important. And I have to say, one of the things which was lovely and beautiful during the election campaign and beyond was the number of women who spoke to me and the number of parents who spoke to me who basically just said, my daughter finds it really inspiring to see what you're doing. In fact, there was even one woman found a way of emailing me a picture of her 4.5-year-old daughter who had some presentation at school. They'd done a thing about the elections, and she'd wanted to watch The Girl Leader on YouTube. And she sent me this picture of her daughter looking at it on a laptop. And I have to say, just the thought that little girls growing up can see a woman can be a leader, and that is something that's possible, I think it matters.
Just very briefly, I think your party's had 4 or 5 leaders in the last 5 years. Is it fundamentally unleadable, whether by a man or a woman?
No, it's not. Clearly, a leadership election currently was not quite in the plan, but hey, these things happen. That's politics. I think it's an important job, and I think I'm proud that we've got really good, talented MPs elected amongst our small but beautifully formed team of MPs, including some great new talent, and I'm looking forward to the leadership contest when it happens.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you on that in a moment. Just want to ask Seda the same question. When you're obviously a Conservative peer, Margaret Thatcher was the first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, came from the Conservative Party. Both female Prime Ministers have come from the Conservative Party, and yet a lot of women say, how does that help us in practical terms if that Prime Minister is not doing things? In Thatcher's case, didn't promote any women around her at all. Or in Theresa May's arguments about the impact on women on the ground. How do you respond to that? The idea that it's tokenism. You're putting someone there, but they're not actually helping the people they represent.
Yeah, well, I think with Margaret Thatcher, it definitely wasn't tokenism. She got there kicking and fighting and screaming to the top, and therefore she absolutely deserved to be Prime Minister.
No, I meant, I'm not questioning what she deserved. I'm saying her actual impact on other women.
So I think there are 2 parts to this. First of all, I absolutely agree with Joe that the number of women who, and certainly women of colour, who say that when I saw you sat around that cabinet table, and remember when in 2010 I was the only non-white face around that cabinet table, they said you sent out a message to say, this is possible. So I think it's the art of the possible suddenly becomes real for people when they see somebody in their image. And we all know, to this day, I support Liverpool. God, I'm going to make some enemies here. But to this day, I support Liverpool because when we turned on the television, we used to see John Barnes. And therefore, we felt, there was some reflection of us in what we were seeing there. Floella Benjamin still meant something to us when we were growing up watching Play School. So I think seeing somebody who is of colour, certainly for me, was really important growing up because it was saying to us that you could do this. Secondly, I think whether you're a woman or whether you're from a working class background or whether you're a person of colour, or particularly in today's debate, on climate, whether you're Muslim, there is a lot of pressure for you not to be be an authentic version of yourself. So I can imagine the pressure on Mrs. Thatcher, having got to where she'd got to, would have been huge to say, don't show any feminine traits, you know, and then everybody else will forget about the fact that you're a woman. It's the same of people of colour. I'm surprised at how many people of colour get into politics and then pretend they're not black or brown, because that way hopefully I can just kind of slip under the surface. And now
which kind of people are you thinking of,
Muslimness,
Saida?
And now, you know, and now with now with the issue of Muslimness, you know, the issue that I consistently have with Muslim people in public life, or specifically Muslims in politics, to say, look, you can't be a convenient Muslim. You either are or you aren't. Either these issues matter to you or they don't. You can't say, well, I'm not really a Muslim until the point you need somebody conveniently to batter a few Muslims, and then I'll stand up and say, well, as a Muslim, I can say these horrible things about Muslims.
Is this just a hypothetical, Saida, or is there someone specific?
Example.
Is there a person who recently resigned from government who you might be thinking of?
I don't know who you could possibly be thinking of.
No idea.
But,
None whatsoever.
But I think authenticity, and this is what I say to a lot of young, I mean, I mentor lots and lots of young people who are entering politics. Actually, interesting, even Labour politicians and Lib Dem politicians, because just entering politics is important. And what I always say to them is, be an authentic version of yourself, because in the end, if you're not, that is what will become your downfall.
Joe, just returning to the theme of speaking truth to power, taking a stand, even if it's an unpopular one, even one that costs you something. You made stopping Brexit your number one goal, your top priority. You refused to budge on that, even when people said to you, it's mad, it's crazy, what are you saying, you're being anti-democratic, etc., etc. Many would argue that's why you lost your job as leader. Are you, looking back with that, are you okay with that? Do you think that was a price worth paying? Do you stand by everything that you said and did?
Well, I mean, we're certainly going to learn lessons from the election and have a process to do that. But on the fundamental issue of, do I think that Britain's place is best in the European Union? And do I think that that was a cause worth fighting for? And do I think that that was a position that millions of people in the country subscribe to and that they deserve to have represented within the democratic process of an election? Yes, I absolutely do. And look, politics, you know, on one level, it is, you know, it's a popularity contest in a sense. But I think if we reduce it down to, you know, what a focus group has said should be the message, then you lose something. Because it also should be about what you believe, what the ideas are. And those ideas won't always be the most popular, but it doesn't mean that they are not worth fighting for. And I think that's what, to me, politics is about. That's what standing up for your principles is about, whether or not the consequence of that is going to be that you win. And
not just not winning, but Heidi mentioned in the previous panel, some of the kind of hate mail that Brexit has led to, especially female politicians who are opposed to Brexit, seem to be a unique category here in terms of Anna Soubry and Heidi Allen and many others. What was that experience like for you? Because obviously you were doing something that was very unpopular. You were being accused, you know, revoking Article 50. You were like the enemy of democracy. You were accused of being. What kind of experience was that like?
I mean, I've got a fairly thick skin, having been involved in politics for, 15 years or more. So in a sense, you've got your different coping strategies of dealing with it. Heidi talked about focusing on the nice things that people sent you. Part of it, I think, is actually not being too swayed by, reading everything that people say about you on social media. I mean, you wouldn't go and eavesdrop on everyone's conversations in the pub when they were having a bit of a bitch about you. So, why should you subject yourself to that?
So you're not an Ed Balls who searches your own name on Twitter.
No, but what there was one point which I did talk about at the time when there was an email received that included a threat against my child, and I have to say that was pretty unsettling. I mean, no parent wants to have that conversation with their child's nursery manager and school head teacher about how they can be kept safe. So I mean, I think there's a wider issue here about, as was discussed in the last panel, about how do we get public debate back onto a much more respectful footing where you can all say, look, I disagree with your view, you've got the right to say what you're saying, and it doesn't make you a bad person that we disagree about something, without necessarily descending into that really polarised and increasingly violent language.
I'm glad you mentioned that you have a thick skin. because I want to ask you this question about how you were criticised by a lot of people on the left who say you went after Corbyn harder than you went after Boris Johnson, and by ruling out any kind of cooperation with the Labour Party, they say that's what caused the situation we're in. They say you could have stopped Corbyn or you could have stopped Brexit, and you chose to stop Corbyn. What do you say to them?
Well, I disagree. I took the view, which I stand by, that I don't think Boris Johnson was fit to be Prime Minister. Said just talked about the problems of Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. I think somebody who... I think it is quite shocking when you think about it. Our Prime Minister is someone who was endorsed in the election by Tommy Robinson and didn't feel any need to distance himself from that at all. I can't think of any previous Conservative leader that would have even thought of that reaction to that situation. And I'm deeply worried about what that means. And on the Labour side, then, Luciana Berger, who was hounded out of the Labour Party and joined the Liberal Democrats, her testimony of talking about the anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, told a story of a man who similarly was not committed to that basic equality, to those basic principles. So I don't think either of them were fit to lead our country. I think that remains true today. And I was open and honest about that fact. I absolutely did everything I could to stop Brexit. And I really regret that wasn't possible.
In your concession speech on election night, you spoke quite passionately about, quote, the wave of nationalism sweeping across the country, how it's bringing dread and dismay, you said, to millions. How worried should the people in this room, in Birmingham, in the UK, be right now about nationalism and nationalists rearing their ugly heads in Britain in 2020 and across Europe?
I think it is a cause for real concern. And we see it in different different outlets for it on different sides of the border. But it's this kind of pulling up the drawbridge, more isolationist approach, a fear of the other, and this has happened. It's not an entirely new phenomenon. It's happened at different points in our history. But I would like us to reclaim the kind of small L, liberal, open-hearted, open-minded, democracy that I believe Britain can and should be. And I don't think there's anything that is inevitable about that. And I think 5 or 10 years ago, it perhaps felt as if, the path of progress would keep going in the same direction. Yeah. It might have little bumps along the way, and it might sometimes be quicker or slower. But I feel like now there is a real concern about, rights, equalities, things that have been fought for being ruled backwards.
Saida, nationalism these days tends to go hand in hand with a hatred or fear of Muslims. That seems to be kind of the partnership. You've been speaking out on Islamophobia and making enemies in the process since 2011, when you famously said it had passed the dinner table test, since 2015, 2016, when you started calling on your party to take it more seriously internally, to investigate it. How hard has it been for you to basically bang on about this cause when your own party kind of refused to listen to you? And you even have people like Matthew Hancock, the health secretary, saying when he's asked about your views on this, he dismissed you for not being, quote, balanced.
Yeah, and I said, thank you for white-splaining that to me. For me, look, this is not popular. This is not an issue which people like to listen to. But when many of us were growing up, we experienced racism. You may not like the term, but it was, we grew up with what was termed as packy bashing. You knew that there was a certain time of the year, in school years, a certain place. If you found yourself, invariably you would get caught up in something which would result in possibly a physical beating or a roughing up. But I kind of felt like, having been a success story, a product of social mobility, now occupying the corridors of power, that somehow I wouldn't be found in those spaces where this kind of thing would occur. And then I discovered what I call respectable racism. So not the thug on the street who kind of smacks you because you find yourself in the wrong place, but actually the kind of racism which is found in editorial rooms and think tanks and political circles, and it's couched in very educated intellectual terms. And Islamophobia, for me, is the way in which the respectable rationalise racism. So they'll say things like, well, I'm not against Muslims, but obviously their religious text is so uniquely violent until you pick out a copy of the Old Testament. Or they will say, I'm not against Muslims, but it's just that they are uniquely violent in terms of their terrorism until you give them a whole history and statistics on terrorism and explain that actually Muslims are a teeny part of that. Or I'm not really against Muslims, but when terrorist attacks happen, they just don't condemn them, at which point every Muslim is sat there screaming at its TV screen saying, we've all condemned it, you just don't want to hear it. So I think all these reasons that are given for why why people feel that it's okay to be racist towards Muslims. And I gave an example recently. One of the arguments that used is, the reason Muslims don't fit comfortably within Britain is because they're uniquely misogynistic and anti-women. Well, sure, you only have to look at the White House to disprove that. Secondly, they will say things like, well, because, they're uniquely homophobic. And what I found fascinating was that Victorian Britain, one of the reasons why Victorian Britain didn't like Muslims was because they felt, and I saw some fascinating research around this, they felt that the story in the Bible around the Prophet Lot and the story in the Quran about Hazrat Lut al-Islam were different, and that the Bible was very clear about this, but the Quran wasn't as clear, and therefore in Victorian Britain the reason they didn't like Muslims was because they were considered to be pro-homosexuality and they were considered to be promoting promiscuous lifestyles. My God, look at this, right? We've now come full circle, but we're still Islamophobic, just for now we're accusing them of something else. So I made a decision very early on that I could either pretend not to be a Muslim and keep my head down, or I looked around the cabinet table and I realized that nobody else was going to say this, so I needed to say it. So that speech, Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test, 2011. I wrote it before we went into government. I always felt that I wanted to do that speech. I mean, it's 10 years old next year. That's, how long this has been going on for. And I wrote the speech. We sent it to 10 Downing Street. They cleared it. When it hit the front pages of the day that I was going to do that speech, 10 Downing Street tried to stop me from doing it because there were some uncomfortable truths in there. And I remember at the time, having briefed this speech, they wanted me to change it, pull it, amend it, all these things were happening. And on the day I did the speech in Leicester, I remember driving down from London to Leicester to do the speech. And my husband actually was in the audience today, was in Yorkshire. And he just jumped in the car and drove down to Leicester. I didn't expect him to be there. And by the time we'd got to Leicester, the speech had been amended so many times by number 10 for it to say absolutely nothing. And I remember my husband walking in and, I had a whole load of civil servants and party people. And he said to them, look, I'd like you to all leave the room. And he turned to me and he said, you wrote this speech a long time ago. And I said, I did. He said, you've wanted to do this speech for a long time. And I said, I have. He said, do you believe in it? I said, I do. He said, well, ditch the amended speech, do the speech you want to do, and uske baad Allah malak hai, right? And it was that moment where I thought, actually, you have to speak the truth. And the journey, as you've seen Mehdi and Joe's watch, has been fascinating. So we started off with this, Islamophobia doesn't exist. I did the speech, we got in some measuring processes. Oh, now we do have statistics, it does exist. Then it was, oh, well, anti-Muslim hatred exists, but we don't like the term Islamophobia. So we'll have a huge row about the term for a while. Then it was, well, we don't really know what Islamophobia is because we don't have a definition. I asked the government to find a definition and they said, oh, well, we can't have a definition because nobody can find agreement. So we then went out and consulted with the community and we got agreement. So we went back to the government and we said, like, you've now got a definition. The Muslim community is kind of more or less, the majority is in agreement. This is the definition. And they went, oh, well, we think we do need a definition now, just not the definition that Muslims want. So we've kind of gone round and round and round.
But here's a question then. If you've been banging your head against this brick wall for all these years, we had Heidi Allen on a previous panel who quit the Tory party over Brexit. Many would ask, why haven't you quit the Conservative Party over this?
For two reasons. One, because ideologically, I'm a centre-right politician, and there is nowhere else right now in Britain where I feel I could find a home. You know, I'm a low-tax, small state, bigger society Conservative, and I don't find, I mean, look, the Conservative Party doesn't feel like a comfortable home, but there is nowhere else for a centre-right politician to have a home. And secondly, because, you know, it's not, there's a really famous, like, Punjabi Urdu saying, I don't know if anybody understands the language here, which is often used as an insult when you feel bullied, which is, you know, teri baap ki jagah hai, is it your father's place, right? You know, Boris ki baap ki jagah hai, Conservative Party, it's not his party, you know, it's not Michael Gove's party.
The problem is, it kind of is, right? That's the pushback. He won the leadership pretty overwhelmingly.
Yeah,
he won a majority at the election. He's in power now, and weirdly, while you've gone after Michael Gove and said some pretty strong things about him, you said recently, I think Michael's view is there's no such thing as a non-problematic Muslim, which he categorically denies. He says it's not true that he was ever admonished at the cabinet table for going on about Muslims, as you've said happened under David Cameron. And people can decide who they want to believe, you or Michael Gove.
And also people should question why during our time in government and whilst David was Prime Minister, why he was never made a member of the National Security Council.
But here's my question to you. Why have you pulled your punches on Boris Johnson, though? Because you said, quote, I call him a centre-ground liberal conservative, and you accused him of making stupid remarks, but not being Islamophobic.
So the difference between Boris and Michael is that Michael believes that most Muslims are problematic. Boris doesn't believe in anything, right? And
hold on. I'm living in a country where the President of the United States does not believe anything at all, does not know anything at all, but I don't think anyone would dispute he's an Islamophobe. I don't think you need to have intent or a ruling ideology. I think if you mock Muslim women as bank robbers and letterboxes, if you say Islam is the problem, if you say Islamophobia is a natural reaction to reading the Quran, all things that Boris Johnson has said, it's weird that you, who's gone after so many senior people in your party, with him you say, no, he's a liberal, okay. He's only stupid.
Well,
why can't you be stupid and Islamophobic?
Yeah, I think, I suppose I have had the advantage of seeing the public version that lots of people see, but I've also had the advantage of working with these people quite closely, and on lots of issues. And I think I have to be honest about my judgment. Look, I'm not going to pull my punches. If I think somebody's an Islamophobe and a racist, I'm going to say they are. And, you know, I didn't pull my punches on other people, so I'm not really going to pull my punches when it comes to Boris. Okay. But having worked with, you know, those different personalities, I genuinely believe that if Boris was surrounded by the right people, I don't think he would be the man he was. Whereas I think Michael could be surrounded by anybody but would still hold those views.
Joe, you mentioned earlier the disgust about Tommy Robinson, and I just mentioned some of the things Boris Johnson said. Do you believe the Prime Minister of the UK is an Islamophobe?
Well, I would answer that by saying if you were sat in a train and you heard someone having a conversation saying the kind of stuff that he's written in his newspaper articles, I think we all know what we would think about the person saying those things. So is it that he is, or, I mean, almost what Sahir is saying is, it's almost that he, like, is prepared to say and to blow those dog whistles, yeah, because he sees an electoral advantage in it. And
it's almost worse than being an ideologue. At least the people who believe that anti-Muslim stuff are consistent.
I mean, as I say, I mean, it's one of many things that does make me feel despair. I just do not think. I do not think it becomes that role when you need to have somebody who is a statesperson, who can bring the country together, who can be trusted to stand up for every citizen of our country. You know, you don't punch down onto groups that are already marginalised, discriminated against, victims of violence in all sorts of different ways. And he's done that consistently, yes, about Muslim women, but also about the LGBT community, about women more generally.
Black kids. Yeah, exactly. And this is a predominantly Muslim crowd, so I do want to ask you, I mean, we know the Tory party has an Islamophobia problem. Saeed has been very eloquent in making the case for many years. Just on the Lib Dems, before you became leader last year, a council candidate was suspended for making anti-Islam remarks. You had a parliamentary candidate in Chingford and Woodford Green who was accused of making Islamophobic remarks by his female Muslim Labour opponent. And your party, correct me if I'm wrong, has never elected a Muslim member of parliament.
you're right, we have not got a nearly good enough record on electing Muslims to Parliament, in electing people of colour more generally. Our parliamentary party now is more diverse than it's been before, but there's still a huge amount to do. I suppose what I would say is, in those cases that you outlined, we took action very swiftly. You know, in every political party, like in society, there are people with views that are frankly unacceptable and who will act in a way that is not acceptable. And, you know, in a large political party, you can't prevent that. But what you can do is, when it comes to your attention, you can have a procedure in place that you deal with it very swiftly, both so that the individual episode is dealt with, but also so that that wider message is understood by everybody in the party, so that people can have confidence that action will be taken.
Okay, so before we go to the audience, I do want to ask a look-back question for both of you, both good and bad. We're in Birmingham. Birmingham got hit pretty hard by austerity measures in a government that you were both part of, 2010, 2015, the Cameron-Clegg coalition. Earlier this week, Sir Michael Marmot, the famous epidemiologist, put out a report saying that we've had life expectancy in the UK stalling for the first time in 120 years. For women in the poorest 10% of areas, it's actually declined between 2010 and 2020. He calls it a lost decade. Other studies, as you know, have accused austerity measures of having contributed to the excess deaths of 120,000 people. When you look back on, both of you, on your time in that government, do you have regrets? Do you look back and think we got that wrong?
Yes and no, for two reasons. One, because there were lots and lots of things that we did as a coalition government which I was fundamentally opposed to, and actually all credit to Nick Clegg and others, because they were my partners in crime for much of the arguments that we had around that table. So yes, do I regret that there should have been other things that I should have been fighting? Yes, but actually there are only so many fights you can fight. And I felt that I was consistently fighting on issues around civil liberties, race, the immigration changes. I mean, there was so much going on during that time that I felt that as most people will do when they go into government, they have to pick and choose their fights, otherwise they lose all of them. So in retrospect, yes, should I have done more around the welfare kind of reform programs? Yeah,
is there a single thing you can point to, like a one regret? So we said pick one thing you wish you could undo. What would it be?
The changes, I think, to universal credit. That was the moment where, you know, to sit down and to have spent time working through the calculations of what this would mean in the pockets of the ordinary family who would be dependent upon universal credit, I think would have been one of the changes that I would have made.
Jo, what do you think is your biggest regret? Is it austerity? Is it,
So, I mean, as I was very open about during the election, you know, we absolutely got some of this absolutely wrong. I mean, the bedroom tax is a classic example of that, where we should have fought harder. We should have won those battles. You know, we fought and won battles, you know, as Saida was saying. You know, that is the kind of process of government anyway, and particularly in a coalition government. But, you know, there was never going to be a scenario under any party where there didn't need to be some cuts in 2010, but I think that the balance between cuts and tax rises, and Saida might disagree with me, this being a low-tax conservative, but I think that that's where some of it should have been different, because you know, we shouldn't have been cutting the top rate of tax, for example, and I did fight against that within government. I fought hard against it, but it was a battle that I lost. So I think that mix between cutting spending and raising taxes is something which should have been balanced differently.
Okay, and just the counterpoint for both of you, give you a chance to make your point. You both, I believe, I'm assuming, have long careers ahead of you still in public life, but looking back, since we talked about regrets, what's your proudest, what do you think, what are you most proud of having achieved?
Gosh, I would say so many little things, really. So that we did some consultation and some advice on non-invasive postmortems. They might be a tiny little thing, but the fact that we got the chief coroner to agree that everybody had a right to ask for a non-invasive postmortem at the time of death, I think is something that affects, you know, at that point in life. The Islamophobia is past the dinner table test is a really important aspect of it. Actually setting up a monitoring system so that police forces monitor hate crime and break it down by a religious thing. But I suppose one of the most personal ones for me was something that actually, again, I wrote up in 2008 before we went into government, working alongside William Hague. And that was, my generation grew up with the guilt of the Balkans War, the guilt of Srebrenica. And for me, I just felt that remembering the lessons of Srebrenica and their relevance, so relevant to the world that we live in today, where effectively Europe, the place where we had the Winter Olympics, where Torval and did that amazing bolero, that literally years, a short time after that, people were killing each other, simply ethnically cleansing people because they were perceived to be Muslim or they were Muslim. So I think for me, making sure that we implemented and started the Remembering Srebrenica program, which this year is so relevant for the anniversary that will be marked in Potocari in Srebrenica, but because now hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of events are done across the country where school children learn about the worst genocide on European soil since the Holocaust.
Okay. I think that deserves an applause. Joe, last word before we go to the audience.
Two things. The first is shared parental leave, which enables parents to decide how they choose to share the time off after their baby's born, which I think is hugely important for now and the future. I mean, the previous panel was talking a bit about work-life balance and how people combine their domestic responsibilities with working lives. And for me, the answer is really simple, that it is about both parents being able to be involved. And I think that we need to do so much more to actually value the role of men as fathers in our society. And for so long, that has been undervalued. They've been seen as if they're an afterthought or they don't know what they're doing. And enabling men to have time at home with their babies, I think, is hugely, hugely important for that bonding. And the second thing I would say is corporate reporting transparency. And I fundamentally think that the relationship between business and society needs to change. The way that capitalism has worked until now is unsustainable, and part of that needs to change is how business engages. And at the moment, transparency is one of the tools that is starting to drive change. So I brought in more transparency on reporting on human rights, reporting on environmental measures, reporting on gender pay gap reporting was my final battle that I won in government. Executive pay differential reporting and giving shareholders more power to hold businesses to account. And I think that those things, as we go ahead into the future, are going to be incredibly important if we're going to properly reshape our economy so that it does work properly for the people in our society and for our planet, where we are, week after week shamed by, the younger generation who are telling us that we have not been getting it right on climate change. So the role of business reporting on that is hugely important.
Okay, we got some time for our audience questions for our two panellists. Raise your hand, wait for a microphone to come to you. I'm going to take them in sets of 3. Please don't give a speech. Please don't be that person that everyone looks at and thinks, why did he get the microphone? And also, try and stick to the topic if you can. We'll start here. Gentleman there with his hand up. Yeah. If you raise your hand, they'll come to you. Or maybe they won't. Is anyone getting a microphone to the gentleman over there? Do you want to stand up so they can see you? Oh, you've already got... Okay, we'll come to you next. She's already got a microphone. Go.
Hi, yeah, very, very quickly. This is a question for Joe Swinson. You say up there that you stand up for women and you speak for the truth, yet you deny the biological reality that there are two sexes. You have said that men who say that they are women and ought to be allowed into our women's sex-segregated spaces, regardless of the fact that some of them, most of them actually, who identify as trans, let's say 80%, because I think there's research to say that, retain their male bodies, essentially. This puts women and children at risk. You're in a room full of Muslim women. I don't want to have to share a gym, a changing room, whatever, with a man. I don't want my cervical smear test to be performed by a male-bodied person. Yet you say that a man who says he's a woman is a woman and should be treated as such. How can you explain yourself to me?
Okay. We'll take the second one there.
Question for Saida Warsi. In the earlier session, Heidi Allen spoke about the need for a team to be able to make change. And I was just thinking about, in the sphere of Islamophobia, did you feel, or do you feel, within the Conservative Party that you have enough of a team to be able to do that? I'm just thinking, if there was a young Muslim today with centre-right tendencies, not sure why they'd want to, but if they wanted to, how would they navigate the Conservative Party today to try that again?
Good question. We should take a third one. Gentleman in the red shirt. Yeah, you're centre.
Thank you very much. Question directed to Baroness Warsi. So you said that you can either be, in this modern day, someone who stands up for Muslim values or not. But often if you stand up for Muslim values, you are going to be far away from the areas where policy is made. So how do you balance that fact of standing up as a Muslim, but also being close to where the power and policy is being made?
Okay. Let's take them backwards. Let's take the third question first.
I don't think standing up for Muslim values excludes you from mainstream Britain or mainstream society. I think what I was saying was that not that you have to be, I mean, look, I'm not a representative of Islam. Around that cabinet table, I wasn't a representative of Islam or Muslims. But what I do believe is that you can't deny who you are to progress in mainstream Britain. I'm not prepared to take any job by saying stuff that I do not believe in simply because it fits somebody else's narrative of me. And that takes me really to the second question. The problem that we have with the Conservative Party and Muslims at the moment is that it's very difficult for Muslims to be authentically themselves within the Conservative Party. About 8 years ago or 10 years ago, Conservative Home published, Conservative Home is a website which used to be loosely connected to the Conservative Party, much more so now. And it published a 10 questions which every Muslim candidate who stands for the Conservative Party should be asked. And it was this bizarre set of questioning, amongst which one of them was, amongst one of them was, what is your view on Israel and what's your support for Israel? And I kind of thought, whoa, why should I even have to answer this question as a Muslim, as opposed to any other person of any other faith having to ask this question? So I think my issue with the Conservative Party is that I find it astonishing how many of my conservative male colleagues are super feminists when it comes to misogyny within Islam, right? They will consistently talk about empowering Muslim women until they meet one and they can't deal with her, right? So my issue for people joining the Conservative Party or joining politics or joining mainstream society at any level to say, if you genuinely believe in empowerment of working class people, if you genuinely believe in empowerment of women or Muslim women, if you genuinely believe in equality for people of colour, then just get out of the way and let us do it on our terms. No, I don't want to be your version of me.
Hold on.
I want to be my version of me.
So would you advise, if a young Muslim woman in the crowd comes to you after this event and says, I'm thinking of joining the Conservative Party and I want to be an activist in the Tory party, would you advise her to do that or not?
So I would say to them, one, how capable are you, because I'm not capable of this, right? I would say, how capable are you of keeping your mouth shut, right? If you can keep your mouth shut, keep your head down until you're actually in a position to make a difference, go for it. But if every time you go in, you're going to get annoyed by what you see around you, because it's not a very comfortable environment. For example, if a young Muslim woman joins the Conservative Party and she consistently talks about misogyny within Islam, she talks about how all Muslim men are appalling and are sexual predators, she talks about how she had a terrible forced marriage, she talks about how FGM is like the biggest issue for her, and these are all real issues, but if she becomes their version of what a Muslim woman should be, she'll go right to the top. But if she goes in and says, you know what, there are some misogynist men in Islam and Muslims, but there are a few in the corridors of power, including places like Downing Street and the White House, that actually, yes, there are issues around violence within Islam and domestic violence within Muslim communities, but actually, if you look at the number of partners who are killed by number of women who are killed by their partners, the majority of them are not Muslim, the overwhelming majority are not Muslim, that actually, yes, there are sexual predators within the Muslim community, but there are just as many, if not more, sexual predators within other communities. Like, if you're prepared to say, let's have a reasonable, rational debate about these issues based upon evidence and fact, that little thing, evidence and fact, then somehow, no, you don't fit our narrative, so therefore you're problematic.
Okay, Joe?
Just hearing Saida talk about that reminded me of the time that I called out Nigel Farage. You might recall that he made a comment, I think this is the run-up to the Brexit referendum, about how if all these migrants come to our country, then there are going to be more rapes as a result, because somehow there's going to be all these rapes. And I sort of obviously challenged this. And then my Twitter mentions, oh my goodness, I suddenly got a little window into Islamophobic Twitter, and people were posting all these links to these horrible websites. And I think I engaged a little bit with some of the people, but the kind of the general view seemed to be that, like, you know, Muslim men were more likely to rape, and there was all this stuff about cologne. And I pointed out actually that domestic violence, yes, is a very big problem in our society, but most women who are attacked, it's by somebody that they know, not by a stranger. And these people did not want to know. And so there's the kind of the taking on board of, we're going to be feminists and kind of take on that mantle when it suits them, when actually the rather inconvenient facts about who does actually commit crime against women, you know, was rather less palatable to those people. Look, on the issue of gender recognition, I mean, that is currently the situation. It's based on self-identification, and, you know, just like every time we go and use the loo, I mean, I've never been asked for my birth certificate when I've gone into a ladies' loo, or indeed a ladies' changing room at the gym. You know, I don't believe it is impossible to protect individuals' rights and to make sure that people are properly protected against risk, and that is the job of of organisations, whether it's the issues about women in refuges and making sure proper risk assessments are done, or whether it's all of us as we go about our everyday lives. And I think we need to just recognise that there's people in our society who do feel very uncomfortable in the gender in which they're born. That's not something that they identify with, and I think we just need to sort of live and let live, really, and we have a law that enables that to happen by and large. I think there might be some changes that are needed to it, and I think we should let people be themselves.
Okay, let's go back to the audience. Let's take 3 more. Gentleman there with the beard. That really narrows it down in a Muslim crowd. Gentleman there with the beard. Although coronavirus could be coming for your beard. Just saying. That's health advice, shave your beard. It's very Islamophobic, the coronavirus.
Thanks for that introduction, Mehdi.
A lovely beard, I must say, since we're on the subject.
Question for Baroness Warsi. So myself and a lot of people in this room might regard the current government in power as an Islamophobic government. Right now there's an opportunity when we see Muslims under attack solely for being Muslim in India for this Islamophobic government, and I say that as my opinion, not as fact, to do something to show that actually, no, they do care about Muslims. That's been going on for a while now, certainly enough time for some sort of response. It might have eluded me. So what has been the response from the Islamophobic Tory government?
Okay, we'll take that question in a second. Although you're jumping to our next panel, we will be talking about India in the very next panel after this one. Next question, anyone else got a question? Yes, gentleman here.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. I think the tag team of the Conservative and the Liberal done a lot of damage, as you said. That was perfectly right. It's not just a universal credit, by the way. It's a university fee, and the list goes on. That's a very, very long thing. But rather than that, can I just ask you something? I know the Indian panel coming next. I just want to see that whether you describe whatever happened in India is a genocide, ethnic cleansing, or whatever. I'm asking both actually parties. Thank you.
Okay. Nobody wants to wait for the next panel. Third question. Can we take another question? Can we take a question from a lady, from a woman? Anybody? Suddenly all the hands go down. Okay, we'll take one from the gentleman there. Stand up, right? Oh, he's already got a mic.
having the honor, like father of being born and growing up in South Africa, and seeing a complete change of regime, seeing people stand up for what they believed with the most powerful voices coming from South Africa, and seeing Mandela and his comrades do that. I have a question to ask, and it seems quite up there, but when Mandela got out of prison, me growing up, I experienced people strapping on guns. The rest of my white friends and family were afraid. Half of them left the country. They were afraid of civil war, of what would happen when people were going to be
Can I ask for a question?
Yeah, thank you. The question is, Mandela stood up and stood for peace, forgiveness. What can this government do to create the same peace and forgiveness as a rhetoric, as a statement? Does that make sense?
You're asking how Boris Johnson could be like Nelson Mandela?
There's more than Boris Johnson in the president, and there's more voices.
All right, let's take this one first. If you want to respond to
well, let me start with the last question. First of all, I just think, Mandela and Boris, it's not going to happen. They're two completely different, there very rarely are people like Mandela born into this world where they actually show through the strength of their character what can be achieved. But what each of us individually can do. So, earlier on, one of the things that Mehdi asked me was, what was one of your biggest achievements in government? When I resigned in 2014, one of the nicest things that I felt was written about that resignation was that I think it was the Tablet or the Church Times wrote that today the church has lost its strongest friend in government, right? So I was the only Muslim around the cabinet table, and yet the church said that it had lost its strongest friend, because one of the cases that I made throughout my time in government was around freedom of religion and belief. And I felt that as somebody who had campaigned for the rights of minorities in my country, in Britain, all my life, when I was in the Foreign Office particularly, I led the battle for the rights of minorities in countries around the world, including having discussions in the heart of Mecca around the rights of minorities in Saudi Arabia, which was against all Foreign Office advice to raise these issues.
So just to link that to the next two questions, are you disappointed that this Foreign Office has said not one word, as far as I'm aware, about the pogroms that we saw on the streets of Delhi earlier this week?
Yeah. Two things. First of all, I think that when WikiLeaks happened, there wasn't a massive international breach of national security. Speak to most of the security experts. They won't say that we were now so vulnerable across the world. But there was a leak of international hypocrisy. Suddenly all the things that we were saying in back rooms was made available for everybody to see in front rooms. And I think the hypocrisy really of our foreign policy, and in the end, remember, I resigned on an issue of foreign policy. There are awful regimes around the world who will do awful things, sadly, to their people. That is what regimes have been doing around the world consistently for as long as we can remember. I'm not interested in what awful regimes around the world are just doing to their people, and anybody who's surprised by what Modi is doing shouldn't be, because he presided over genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gujarat going back nearly 2 decades. We know who this man was. There was a reason why he was considered to be a pariah. There was a reason why he wasn't allowed to come to the United Kingdom. There was a reason why most respectable politicians in the West and around the world just did not even want to shake his hand. He happens now to be Prime Minister of India. So anybody who knew Modi and who knew what Modi had done in the past knew this was coming.
Are you
anybody
disappointed
who
the
knew
FCO
about
hasn't
the
said
RSS.
anything?
What I'm concerned about is not what Modi is doing, which was entirely expected, but the fact that we as a country once again have lost our moral compass in being able to say wrong is wrong. How difficult is that?
Quick question, because we're going to be talking more about this with Owen Paterson on the next panel, but since you're here, you're also a Conservative, you were in the Foreign Office. Why do you think it is, if you put yourself in the position of Dominic Raab, why hasn't he said anything? What's the logic behind it?
2 issues. 3 issues, actually, if I'm entirely honest. One, because we have strategic interests in India, and post-Brexit we're going to have even greater economic interests, and therefore we'll just turn a blind eye to human rights. Secondly, because actually we have a cabinet in which there are individuals who sit around that cabinet who have incredibly close relationships, not just with Modi, but also with the RSS, and this is well documented, and so therefore there is
Any names in mind, Saida?
I mean, listen, you know, who am I to talk about people, whether they're ugly or pretty? Thirdly, in their views, ugly or pretty in their views, right? Thirdly,
I have a feeling that you might be in a newspaper in the next 24 hours, maybe.
Thirdly, and this is a reality of the world that we're living in, right now it's not very fashionable to speak out against those people who actually are victimizing Muslims. You know, the Conservative Party won't even speak about, sadly, its own issue of the way it treats Muslims. I think we are being entirely, we've been incredibly optimistic if we think that it will speak out against other people in other parts of the world who are treating Muslims in that way.
Joe, have the Liberal Democrats said anything about what's going on in India?
I'm sure we have. One of the delights of not being an MP anymore is that you don't have to be on the email list for every statement that is made about every event. So I can't pretend to be an expert on the matter and exactly what has been said. But look, Saida is right that we have seen so much victimization of Muslims. And we have seen a government that is not prepared to call it out. And it is one of the many consequences of our new place in the world order that actually reduces our ability to take a stance, to stand up for what is right, because we are much more in a supplicant position. We are relying on other larger, bigger countries. We are reaching out for new trade deals, which will still not be as good as the trade deal that we have just turned our back on. And so this is one of the areas in which it then perhaps becomes an issue of convenience for ministers not to be available to pass comment on issues or just to go into hiding. And I think the question that was asked about South Africa, I mean, it really does... it does show you what true statesmanship is like, and Saida's also right that doesn't come along very often. When you think about somebody who was imprisoned for more than 2 decades, to have the capacity to then speak about peace and forgiveness in that environment and the power that brought with it, I think any one of us in this room can only begin to imagine how we might feel in that circumstance and how difficult that would be. But it also ultimately shows us how these issues fundamentally get resolved. And if you go back to what happened at the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, if you look at examples right around the world, where there has been strife and division and fighting, it takes extraordinary resilience and open-heartedness on behalf of people, and that willingness to take risks as well. The end of the Cold War. I mean, in all of these circumstances, you've seen leaders who have been able to do something which would almost have seemed to be impossible, but they have taken that step, and that's what has moved forward. And I think that's a quality that we should value in people when we see it.
And on that note, we're going to have to leave it there. Your panel, Joe Swinson, Saida Warsi. Thank you very much to both of you.